Hello everybody. It is my pleasure to present my recent research project on digital museology that is transforming under the pressure of the 24/7 digital lockdown instigated by the pandemic crisis. I hope that my presentation today will provoke some interesting questions, ideas and debates, and I would be really happy to receive your feedback and comments via email to continue this discussion. My presentation will consist of several sections that you can see on the slide. But before the presentation unfolds the analysis, it is worthwhile, though, to step back to explain the background story of the historical development of the museum definition. Going back to the times of the Renaissance, one can trace the development of the first European museums that emerged from collections of strange objects arriving from the New World. Most of the collections in the 16th century were housed in the cabinets of curiosity. The influx of artifacts from the New World reaching Europeans paved the way for new models of knowledge, giving rise to so-called universal museums. By the 18th century, the concept of the museum had been established and revealed the trend towards openness, sociability, and publicity. It rooted itself in the tradition of order and display that could communicate ideas and draw historical parallels and cross-cultural comparisons to project foundational concepts. With a strong colonial legacy, museums became important political actors on the world stage by exercising power of communicating new meanings of their ethnographic and cultural collections. Interestingly, by the end of the 18th century, the narratives of these collections developed strong links to the idea of the nation. With the concept of the museum as an instrument for the democratic education of the masses or the citizens, the beginning of the 20th century, museums served as national expressions of identity. Eventually, from being civilized tools to fulfill the tasks of the cultural governance of the populace, museums transformed into a means of constructing cultural communities through which power was exercised in terms of cultural inclusion or exclusion. More recently, the international agenda of contemporary museology has urged these institutions to become more responsible social actors. Since the inception of the new museology movement, the development of public and educational programs has become just as important as the more traditional tasks of cultural preservation. This revolution shifted the main emphasis to the cultural and social contexts within which the meanings of objects in museums is generated. More importantly, it promised to transform a museum from a temple into a forum to provide a mediative space where cultures could meet and debate. In the 20th century, the museum as agency has been steadily developing under the patronage of such as international organizations as International Council of Museums. This is a non-governmental organization under formal relations with UNESCO. It works to provide museums with guidelines, policies, tools, and best practices to support and establish them to better serve the societies in which they exist. In 1946, ICOM defined the museum as a collection. In 1951, the museum agency turned into an establishment, finally becoming a permanent institution only in 1961. The latest version was adopted in Vienna in 2007 and defined the museum as a non-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society and its development. In 2019, ICOM delivered the online global crowdsourcing campaign to collect public contributions to redefine the museum agency in the 21st century so that it can better reflect the rapid and dynamic changes in contemporary museology. In July 2019, upon the completion of its global crowdsourcing exercise, ICOM proposed a new definitions. Museums are not permanent institutions anymore. Museums are democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about past and the futures. The definition campaign resulted in a failure to adopt a new proposed definition of the museum during the ICOM Extraordinary General Conference in Kyoto in 2019. The new definition was met with significant opposition in the world of museum professionals. In August 2019, 24 national ICOM branches, including French, Italian, Spanish, German, Canadian, Russian, submitted a petition requesting ICOM to postpone the vote on the proposed definition. In the international media, the committee was widely accused of delivering an ideological text that would have little legal value. For example, museology professor François Mares stressed that it would be hard for most French museums, starting with the Louvre, to correspond to the new definition. However, it is important to also highlight what sparked such a radical transformation in understanding the museum agency in proposing such a definition. Specifically, the 2018 ICOM report pointed out that creating a new definition was needed, actually, to decolonize museums and anchor the discussion of their futures in the larger frameworks of general societal trends and issues of the new century. Particularly, this decolonization agenda set the context for redefining the museum from a permanent, non-for-profit institution to a democratizing, inclusive, polyphonic space. This radical imbalance between the traditional conservational purposes of museums and their social functions can, in fact, be conceptualized through a tense historical relationships between the global South and the global North, specifically through their differences in understanding the museum role in place in the society. In the Global South, the development of the new experimental museums significantly challenged the canon of contemporary museology by interrogating whether a museum was still a permanent institution or a more inclusive space or even a forum of a political resistance and social activism. Since the 1970s, new museology inspired decolonization working practices of museums in many countries, including Brazil, Mexico, Canada, China, Japan. In many cases, museums in these countries had already functioned in context outside of the confines of eco-museum definition. However, the idea of an eco-museum that emerged in the second part of the 20th century, a fluid and open concept of new museology, has mainly remained excluded from the ICOM definition and also from the Oxford English Dictionary. Despite a high level of activism in the Global South to reinforce the value of museums as predominantly a social actor to address the problem of colonialism, imperialism, nationalism, and elitism, the concept has been contested for its utopianism. While the new definition proposed by ICOM didn't receive a global recognition, I would like to argue that in a way it predicted a new turn in contemporary museology instigated by the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Specifically, under the pressure of the global digital lockdown, museums strengthened and advanced their virtual channels of communication, transforming them into more inclusive polyphonic spaces, going beyond their physical and material manifestations. Second, the COVID-19 global outbreak urged museums to engage more deeply with causes and issues of global significance as important actors who can actually contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. A museum agency has long been conceptualized as an imaginary space, or a museum without walls, especially in light of the post-museology theory. Understood as distributed spaces, museums increasingly operate as hybrid institutions existing between physical and virtual realities. The global outbreak of COVID-19 virus has forced museums and galleries worldwide to innovate as never before. Despite mass closures, many museums have increased their digital services. A lot of them experienced the growth of online visits, reaching in certain cases up to 150% of regular online attendance. Indeed, in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, virtual visits to museums have acquired a new level of significance and visibility. For instance, in 2020, Museum launched a new mobile app, Museum from Home, that allowed audience to experience artworks from the comfort of their homes. Users are able to virtually place paintings and other objects onto their walls and interact with them outside the museum. Museum also collaborated with Massachusetts Institute of Technology to conduct a research on the perceptions of art through augmented and virtual reality. In May 2020, they issued a report with findings that in a way challenge assumptions about how people experience art, particularly discussed by Walter Benjamin in his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. While Benjamin argued that reproduced copies lose their authenticity and aura, the report by contrast stressed that the human brain doesn't really differentiate between digitally reproduced artworks and their originals. Another hybrid museum practice that expanded its scope and reach under the pandemic crisis was live streaming. It offered a new channel for international audiences to engage with museums and their heritage collections, also reinforcing the distributed nature of contemporary museum that exists at the edge of its physicality and virtuality. For instance, in the midst of the pandemic crisis, dozens of museums in China, including the National Museum of China and many other museums throughout the country, live streamed their programming on TikTok and Kuaishou, the most popular online platforms with hundreds of millions monthly active users. The Ministry of Culture and Tourism reported that during the Spring Festival in 2020, museums across China live-streamed more than 2,000 exhibitions online, attracting over 5 million visits. The Palace Museum in Beijing, also known as the Forbidden City, has held several live-streaming guided tours broadcasted on CCTV News that were attended by 10 million viewers from around the world. While museums have been experimenting with live streaming for quite a while, during the pandemic crisis, it became a popular trend for transmitting museum collections and treasures to mass audiences in a more engaging way. This further expanded their understanding of a role and place of a museum in contemporary society. However, the pandemic didn't only urge museums to experiment with new digital formats that extended further their virtual borders. It also engaged them further with global issues and planetary concerns and causes. Specifically, it set a powerful context in which important process of museum decolonization started to unfold under the pressure of the international public discourses amplified through the digital channels of communications. A good illustration of this process is the Black Lives Matter movement. Not only it challenged museums in the USA, but also significantly affected museums in other countries. The movement urged many museums to face uncomfortable conversations about the colonial past of museums, which in many cases served imperialistic power structures operating on the economies of slavery. In the UK, the Bristol Museum and Art Gallery and the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool supported public protests against racial injustice and the removal of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. In France, several museums made a public announcement about the museum's commitments to restore at least some of their cultural heritage to communities in Africa. Many museums across countries express solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, especially on social media. However, they have been severely criticized for their rather performative acts of solidarity that could be better framed as practices of selectivism rather than real actions that could combat racial oppression, injustice, and inequality. These uncomfortable conversations taking place on social media urged museums to take first steps toward institutional changes. For example, Guggenheim's post of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement on Twitter triggered hardened conversations and thousands of reports and comments from the Black artist community who accused Guggenheim in racial injustice to artists and curators of color. As a result, Nancy Spector, the former chief director of the museum, stepped down from the position amid accusation of racism from Chaedriel Pieuvre, a former guest curator of the Jean-Michel Basquiat exhibition. While the internal investigation conducted by Guggenheim cleared Spector of racial behavior, she left the museum after almost 34 years of work. The latest appointment at the Guggenheim Museum of Naomi Beckwith to serve as a deputy director and chief curator offered a convincing evidence that important transformations are happening in response to global public protests and voices raised in support of Black communities. I wouldn't have taken this position if I didn't feel the museum was doing that healing work, the new deputy shared. Now it's clear that a museum's job is not just to preserve art history, but to preserve multiple art histories. My presentation today attempted to trace new meanings, trajectories, and avenues in contemporary museology emerging under the pressure of the global coronavirus outbreak. It provided examples that actually point changes happening on two levels of museum international communications, in terms of the spaces and formats, as well as in terms of the key meanings, messages, and narratives developed under the pressure of the global digital lockdown. Thank you for your attention today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Please feel free to connect to continue the conversation. I'm really looking forward to meeting all of you virtually or face-to-face if opportunities present themselves. So stay safe.